This is the first event of many that come under the rubric of Culture and Enterprise Presents ... And we are looking in the programme to bring a number of different guest speakers in over this academic year. So if you've heard about this already, you should hear about the next things coming up. Welcome also to me doing this thing, which is our first one of this term this year. This is funny. I need to give a little bit of context to this talk. I spent probably from about 1989 to 1999 interested in. We've gone off again. Is it not working at all? I spent those years being interested in the relationship between humans and machines. At the beginning of that time, sort of 89 to 92, I was doing my PhD in philosophy, and my topic was the ways in which our senses of self is spaced on space. At that same time, about 89, I started getting interested in things like virtual reality and what that might mean for our sense of self. And I, through the 90s, worked on what became known as cyber theory. 97, I had published a chapter in a book that was called Become Cyborg. My chapter was called Become Cyborg. And it was a critique of what was then the dominant movement in body modification practice, which talked about people who modified their bodies as modern primitives. And I was interested in tattooing and piercing and other forms of modification. My chapter was, however, pitched at the idea that people who modified their bodies in those ways, rather than being modern primitives, were primitive cyborgs. And that one day a cyborg historian of its race will look at the people in the 90s who were opening up their skin and the internal activities of their bodies to the world, to possibly machinic or certainly non-biological parts. Would look at those people as being the primitive versions of its own race, I suppose. About 2000, I got bored with all of this stuff, and that whole sort of side of theory sort of died down a bit. A couple of years ago, I started to do some work and having a chat with a guy who was the director of Microsoft's Envisioning Lab in Seattle. The Office Envisioning Lab. It's like a pre-R&D, conceptual, imaginative, experiential. And he'd been one of my students here when I was teaching product design. Anton, he also had at that time a PhD in biophysics. And he said to me when we met up a couple of years ago, he said, "Jamie, do you know what, this cyber stuff is coming back?" And I was thinking, yes, Anton, it is coming back. And this is coming back in a slightly different way, but much more in terms of the relationships between ourselves, our bodies, and the data that we generate in spaces that aren't, quote, real or physical. And we were thinking that, yes, more needs to be done thinking about our relationship with ourselves, especially ourselves as articulated and expressed through data, or big data. Right? So think about these contexts as we're coming through. When I follow an innovation guru No, I don't follow him. I follow what he said once, which was always begin a presentation with a picture of your kids. So there's mine. This is about a year old. No, they're all about 18 now. No, this is about a year old. There is some other sort of biological aspect to my life, but I am going to talk to you about cyborgs. And I'm going to talk to you about cyborgs and split this talk into a number of different parts. First, I'm going to unpack what a cyborg is and how it might play out in our sense of relationship between technologies and bodies. Then I'm going to use the work of Spinoza, 16th, 17th century philosopher, who had a very different understanding of what constitutes a body. And then use these things together to think of what this might mean for us. Okay? Is that okay? I'm happy to field questions as we go along. Just, make it known. It might well be that I say, oh yeah, I'm going to answer that in a minute, but we can play around with whatever we need to do. So I'm going to begin with two quotations. And first is by a psychoanalyst and philosopher called Felix Guattari. And he says this, that people have little reason to turn away from machines, which, the machines, are nothing other than hyper-developed and hyper-concentrated forms of certain aspects of human subjectivity. That's what machines are. And emphatically not those aspects that polarize people into relations of domination and power. This is my first quotation. My second quotation is from the self-taught philosopher and ex-computer artist Manuel de Landa, who back in a marvellous little book from 1991 called War in the Age of Intelligent Machines, which, if anyone has heard about drones, it should be reread right this very minute. But anyway, in this book he says that technology must cease to evolve with the goal of getting humans out of the loop and aim instead at forming with humans a higher level synergistic machine. These are my two epigrammatic quotations that I would like to leave bubbling away on the back burners of your intellect as we go through and may well come back to some of these. So the structure. I'm going to talk about cyborg. I'm going to talk about affect in terms of Spinoza's body before making some final remarks. This should take us up to time. First up then, the cyborg. Cyborg is a word that has been contracted from two others, cybernetic and organism. Cybernetic comes from the Greek kybernetes, which is interesting. It means steersman. You might find it sometimes talked about as a navigator, but a Kubernetes is much more hands-on. It'd be also known as piloting old days. Somebody who would steer you through the rocks and the rapids coming into a port. And this then leads to cybernetics, which is the science of systems which exhibit unconscious self-control mechanisms. And this is really important. A sort of classic cybernetic system would be something like the thermostat for your heating. And once you set it up, it should control itself. The thermostat would register when the heat in its area reaches the point at which you set it, and then turn off the heating. When that heat, then the ambient temperature goes below the mark that you've set, it will turn it into. But this is self-control through a positive feedback loop between the elements within the system. Okay. It's a cybernetic one. So on the other side of that, we have an organon, an organism, which is an organon, an implement. And we think of an organism as an organised, ordered, neatly arranged, I suppose, living being. This term cyborg was first coined in 1960 by a couple of writers who were writing about space travel at that time. Kleins and Klein. And they say, as here, the cyborg deliberately incorporates exogenous components. Exogenous means components that have been born outside of the system. Okay, so stuff constructed, not developed within the organism. So a cyborg deliberately incorporates exogenous components, extending the self-regulatory control function of that organism in order to adapt it to new environments. This they thought was really important if we were going to, if humans. I'd like you to underline every time I say humans, because it's not easy. It's not a thing. Okay? Beware anyone that says humans to mean us. Okay, I'll come back to that a bit later. Anyway, let's roll back. That if humans were going to explore space, what they need to do is, rather than take a bit of Earth atmosphere with them, in which they can be just like we are, what we would need to do is adapt our bodies to function in those spaces. And we'd adapt our bodies by incorporating exogenous, by incorporating things that have been developed outside of the normal, quotes, human, quotes, productive system, and bring these things together so that the new entity, this cyborg, would be able to function in this outside space, this outer space. And they explain this. Altering man's bodily functions to meet the requirements of extraterrestrial environments would be more logical, I should say, than providing an earthly environment for him in space. Artifact-organism systems, which would extend man's unconscious self-regulatory controls, are one possibility. And that is another way of saying, produce a cyborg if you want to explore space. Can you see this picture that I used in the background? This is a mouse from around that time, 1960. It was an image that was used in the article that I've just been quoting from. And it's a mouse with what was known as the rose osmotic pump. And what it is, it's like a drug thermostat for the mouse's system. So the mouse, in order to live, it needs its bodily system, its organism needs a certain amount of drugs in order to allow it to live. This rose osmotic pump not only delivers the amount of drugs that are necessary, but it stops delivering when the mouse's system has been reached its capacity for that drug. The mouse's system will then use or evaporate that drug through its body, and then when it needs some more, the rose osmotic pump delivers some more. Right? So once you set it up a bit like your thermostat for your oil, this should be able to run and run and run. Okay. Until you need to put some more drugs in. But this is a step. This was a step towards cyborg. There's a way in which we might be able to think of this mouse as one of, if not the first, cyborgs. Jump forward a few decades. The marvellous sci-fi writer William Gibson writes in, I beg your pardon, he mentions in a documentary in 1994, he says the most notable trait of our technology is that it's getting closer to the skin. There's a way in which what he says is that the technosphere within which we humans are living and operating is gradually getting closer and closer and closer, such that it is not only contiguous with our bodies, sort of draped or carried by our bodies, but these things are gradually on a path to burrowing into or even through our bodies. Let me think of some examples here. Here's Steve Mann. He's a technologist at MIT. And we can see probably from, this is sort of early 90s, where he's got a head-up display coming through onto the sort of the glasses visor that he's got, and the sort of computing power he needs to develop and power these specs. And as the 90s moves on and through and into the 2000s, we can see what William Gibson says back in 94 is happening. But this array is simplifying, is growing smaller and getting closer and more less obvious, so to speak. Such that his wearable computing, Steve Mann's wearable computing array, what would have been here is now just up there. And we may be familiar with this Google's short-lived experiment with head-up display glasses, which they didn't say was necessarily a failure, but they've put on hold until another sort of time where it can happen. We, I think, are fairly comfortable with the ubiquity and the proximity of technology and our what we feel is necessary technological stuff. We're much more comfortable with the proximity of that to our bodies than maybe we were 20 or 30 years ago, give or take the success or otherwise of this sort of thing. Such that we are also familiar with something that was important through the 90s and died a bit of a death and is becoming important again, something like wearable technology. I like this example of the sort of the computing technology that we may have once carried around with us in a laptop or even a smartphone, sort of getting smaller and being carried around with us on something like a watch. I like this especially because it's presented in proximity to something much more familiar in terms of body modification, in terms of tattooing. There are tattoos that also incorporate metallic elements so that they can act as circuitry. And the ideas of these sorts of things operating with each other in order to not only blur the boundaries, but to make utterly indistinct the differences between inside and outside, I think is really remarkable these days. But I think there's also something not quite cyborgy about wearable tech. I'm going to show you a
a sort of concept project by Philips from 2000 in a project they had called New Nomads. And what we have here, I think, is illustrated some of the ways in which wearable tech doesn't quite meet up with cyborgs in the way that I'm thinking. Here we have different accounts or different expressions of portability and the portability of technology. And we have, sort of controls for, I beg your pardon. We have headphones in a hood, the circuitry inside, and we have different sorts of interfaces with what we need spread around the garment. I'm not sure whether carrying something differently and becoming a cyborg are necessarily the same thing. Maybe they overlap or interrelate. But I'm happy to have that discussion if anyone wants to. This might be closer to the mouse. This is an expression of inoculation. Is there anyone here who hasn't been inoculated against anything? Sometimes there are. So what we have with inoculation against different types of diseases, what we have with this is the implementation within our organic, quotes, human system of exogenous components, albeit biological components rather than otherwise thought technological machinic components. Of biological exogenous components, viruses and so on, that have been introduced into our biological system in order to get our biological system to operate in its environment in a more prolonged way, or certainly in a different or better way even. Yeah? And I think this is really meaningful. I think there's a way in which this makes us already beyond human, or certainly beyond whatever we might think of as a sort of a baseline, quotes, normal human. We have already altered ourselves so that we perform or function better or longer in our earthly environment, let alone anywhere else. Yeah.
My brother-in-law just had a pacemaker fitted.
Okay. Yeah.
Which is perhaps more obviously cyborg.
I'm going to come on to something just like that in a minute. Somebody once said to me in the 90s that they understood why it was that I was so interested in cyborgs. I said, oh yeah, why is that? They said, yeah, you were premature. So I was born 10 weeks premature, and I was a kilo and a bit when I was born, which was quite a big deal in 1966. And I had to be kept alive by machines in a box for 3 months. And so my friend said, yeah, you are here because of the value and power of the machinic, at least at one moment interfacing with your biological system. And then thereafter have incorporated other laboratory or technological produced systems into my body to allow it to function. But as Richard just mentioned, there may be other things that we can think of as being closer to our understanding of what a cyborg might be in terms of, machinic bits. So here is a retina implant, and it's only from a few years ago. I'm going to see if I've got. No, it doesn't say. I think it's about 2012, something like that. This is an implant, a chip that has been implanted in the macular region of the retina. And what it does is it allows people who were not able to see because of whatever was going on in the macula, the ability to see at least certain shapes or distinctions between shading. And I think we might be able to, yes, here we see that same chip and the way in which the circuitry for it comes out of the back of the retina. And what it does is they create a groove in the side of your skull where the interface sits and the power sits, but the rest of it sort of goes through the groove and then in and behind to the retina. This may not be exactly like the thermostatic system of the mouse, but there's something about the alteration or elongation or improvement or otherwise of our bodily systems through its interface and deep personal biological interface with the machinic. So pacemaker would be another one. I think why I use this one rather than a pacemaker is that the way in which some of these things are carried around, the interface is somewhat different. But I think it's not utterly different. The eyes are interesting as well. I mean, maybe this is sort of in brackets over the side. Eyes are interesting. In vertebrates, eyes are an outgrowth of your brain. In things like cephalopods, like octopus, whose brains are distributed across their whole body and even through their tentacles, the eyes, the brain is an ingrowth of the outer sensing systems, which I think is, I don't know. I thought that was interesting. I'll just move back. I'll move back into the eyes. Eyes are great. I mean, as soon as you mess around with eyes, you're messing around with your brain, like directly. Some of us sometimes press lenses onto the surface of our eyeballs. Not quite cyborgy, but on the way maybe. Is this the next step? Is this maybe how we understand what a cyborg might be through the sort of the imaginative work of things like anime or manga or other sort of science fiction stuff? Is this the next step from the macular retinal implant? Why make myself simply function? Why not improve? One of my friends, actually she works here, she's my friend who's a professor of fashion theory, Caroline Evans. We were talking about these sorts of things years ago, so 20 years ago or so, and she was saying that she said to her son, or her son said to her, that he wanted to get rid of his hand and have a big, huge iron claw, which I sort of thought was cool. And is it the next? What's the next step? Where are the next opportunities for the development of the possibilities for our bodies, and everything else that's included? What we have here is, as I've mentioned before, this sense of a dissolution between boundaries, a dissolution between the things that come from outside and the things that come from inside. There is a sense in which the things that used to be known as biological are now technological, and the things that were simply thought of as being technological are also biological. So things that were made are now grown, and things that were grown are being made. And there's ways in which these things are totally dynamically crossing over into each other, such that it's really difficult to see where one thing is or should be, right? As we mentioned a little bit earlier, there could be a sense in which we think of ourselves as being beyond mere humans, because of the interventions that we've already taken into our bodies. William Gibson, in the documentary that I mentioned to you a little earlier, he wondered whether his great-grandfather would be able to recognize us as being human. I would ask you to wonder the same thing. There's a point that is discussed by some sort of mathematicians, but also people who are interested in technology and robotics and these sorts of things. There's a point known as a singularity, which is a point beyond which the current ways of thinking about reality no longer apply. So in physics, singularity is usually used to define that point at the very bottom of a black hole, where the, quotes, laws of physics no longer apply, because everything has been mashed up out of all recognition. People are saying the same thing about this topic we're talking about right now. And there's a sense in which there's a singularity beyond which the questions of what makes a human or otherwise are so utterly different that they cannot be recognized from this particular point. Some people think that's coming, and we haven't reached that point of singularity yet. Other people think that it's come and gone, and we're well beyond that point of singularity. I think it might be both, but it depends where you live in the world and what your economic power might be. And it may well be that different types or classes of human stroke cyborg will develop at different rates on this planet, depending upon whether you're poor or rich, or come from a poor region or a rich region, and so on. So it's not simply to do with questions of technology, but also about politics and capital. And maybe we can think about that too. This is another bit from Guattari. Let's go through it. He says in this essay from 92, I think, Regimes, Pathways, Subjects. So he says this: the only point that I am making is that unlike other revolutions of subjective emancipation, he's thinking of political revolutions, especially things that he was involved in, like the events in May 1968 in Paris, or the events in Italy through the 70s regarding Radio Alice and the free radio movement. But unlike these things, individual and social practices for the self-valorization and self-organization of subjectivity are now within our reach. This, I think, is really important for him. What we can become as humans, and therefore what ourselves, the potential for actualization of ourselves in different ways, he says, are now within our reach, and they're within our reach largely because of the proximity between us and technology, right? And unlike, say, political revolutions, which usually dissolve without promising the actualizations that they've promised, right, almost entirely, that these are much more within our grasp, and we are much more able to actualize our potentials through them. He says, and perhaps for the first time in history, have the potential to lead to something more enduring than mad and ephemeral spontaneous outpourings like normal revolutions. In other words, to lead to a fundamental repositioning of human beings in relation to both their machinic and natural environments, which at any rate now tend to coincide. We mentioned this a little while ago, that the quotes natural and the quotes unnatural are becoming each other, and in a very overt way. Maybe they always were, but they're very obvious to us these days. So think to yourselves, what can we become as a result of what we can make? And this is when these sorts of questions become very important to people who are involved in design or creative practices, the like of which we have here. So the individual and social practices for the self-valorization and the self-organization of subjectivity. So subjectivity is that which we can think of as being us, right? Ourselves. We think of it another way as saying ourself, in short. But the possibilities for us to achieve different types of self-potential, he says, are within our grasp, much more than ever before. And what this does is lead to a fundamental repositioning of human beings in relation to machinic and natural environments. And this for him is really important politically, as well as psychologically and socially. These things are important for Guattari. Now, some of these things have been expressed creatively through artists like, oh, this is a bit bleached out, sorry. Artists like the Australian performance artist Stellark. Have you guys heard of Stellark? Maybe. When he laughs, he sounds like a really dirty old man. So, you know, try not to hear him laugh. But what he's done throughout his performance art career is to use his body and modifying his body and pushing his body to extremes of endurance and pain in order to perform, right? What he was doing in the 90s was really interesting, is that he was attaching machines to himself. So maybe you can see a little bit here. He's got a third hand, and given the technology of the time, what he did was to wire that third hand up to different muscle groupings in his body. So if he twitched those muscles, it would make that third hand move. Okay? And he learned how to twitch to make that hand do different things, which is the sort of ways in which prostheses were developed in those times. Now, prostheses are much more wired directly into our nervous system, but this was much more of a sort of muscle electric production of movement. What he did in this is to hook himself and his third hand up via this is his sort of wiring diagrams, up to the internet as it was back then. And what you could do when he was doing this performance was to find his page and click on bits of his body, right? And it would send an electrical signal. So I suppose depending upon where most of the internet world was clicking, it would prioritize some over the other. So if everybody was clicking his left leg, it would send an electrical message to the muscles in his left legs, and it would twitch, right? So what we had with him, and he'd do these weird sort of dance performances, but what we had with him was the distribution of the control over his body across the internet as it was right then. So we could not say where his active power exactly lay. This was also happened in a similar performance where he in his third hand, you can just see it a little bit there, was rigged up to a very marvelous looking industrial robot arm from the 90s. And he would move, and however he moved would cause a reaction in the robot arm. And then this is a pretty huge thing, and it would swing around and he'd have to duck out of the way. And as he ducked out of the way, it would cause another movement, which he didn't know was coming. So in the end, you had the development of a sort of a swarm-like total performance between him and the robot that wasn't located in the control of either one of them. And it was massively interesting, okay? and massively interesting for us, especially when we think about the ways in which we might be connected and strung out to other technological and across other technological systems and constructions. Okay. Have you, I remember recently a friend of mine went to, they used to be called bank managers, but now I think they're sort of customer accounts assistants, whatever it is, went to see one, and this bank worker looked at the accounts and the credit cards and everything of this friend of mine, and went through and said, right, okay, you've been making these transactions, yes, I know the sort of person you are. You know, you like doing this and doing that, doing the other. And my friend wanted to say, no, that isn't me at all, but couldn't, because the bank manager had got it exactly right. Exactly right. So there's a way in which, even though it's expressed in this particular way, there's a way in which the generation of data that is mediated and that agglomerates in different forms and places as data are also us, right? And where the patterns of behavior as evidenced through our data can be regarded as having not only a psychological or social impact, but very much a physical impact. There's a really interesting thing that's happened in China in recent years. It's just piloted now, but it will become compulsory across everyone. A sort of a social trust score that is built up from your transactions and everything else, right? And all citizens will be given a valuation, sort of the gamification of cultural behaviour, so that if you have a certain score, you will be allowed to take out a loan or go on travel. And if you go below a certain score, as evinced by your data production, you will not be allowed. So already some people taking part in this pilot are not allowed to go on train travels. Or if your score's a little bit higher, but still underneath, you're not allowed to go on travel abroad, and so on. You know, there's different sort of benefits and otherwise. So already this sort of the gamification of us through our relationships with technology and the data that we produce are already happening. And if we think this is just something that's happened in China, this also happens to us in terms of, you know, a credit score that we might have that may allow or disallow us from having a mortgage at different times. You know, these things happen. This is why it's important to consider what it means to be a cyborg. Oh, here we are, look, here's Stellark again, bless him, with his third arm, but this time he's got these hooks through his skin and sort of suspended. You like these sort of things. I'm going to mention again humans, okay? I said, underline this, be wary of humans. Now, we've been talking about the ways in which our bodies are opened up to the technosphere, right? And to think what happens when our sense of agency or control is distributed and not necessarily located wherever we might think it's located, right? Well, the marvelous political scientist Jane Bennett, writing in 2010 in this amazing little book called Vibrant Matter, A Political Ecology of Things, she says, there was never any time when human agency was anything other than an interfolding network of humanity and non-humanity. Today this mingling has become harder to ignore. And I think certainly these days, this concept of a biome Do you know what I mean by a biome? You know, the bacterial ecology of our bodily systems is much more readily discussed than it was when I was doing all of this stuff on Cyborgs many years ago. So there is a sense in which our bodies are so interspersed and covered with microbiological, bacterial and other life forms, right? Such that our biome, if you added up the genetic information of our biome, it's more than the genetic information of our human bodies, right? So our bacteria help us digest. They also produce things like serotonin and other neurotransmitters, which can affect our mood. They also live in our skin to help us have smooth or supple skin, right? They're everywhere. We are them. We are already a community, a commonwealth of different types of entities that we live together with. The idea that we then live together with machines is just a question of matter, different types of material rather than different grades of scale. We are already many. Even what we feel or think may be impacted by our bacterial commonwealth. Today, she says, this is becoming harder to ignore. For Jane Bennett, who's was started out writing this book as a commitment to environmental, ecological, political activism, and she ends up writing about how matter is vibrant with life and cutting across us. These things become really important. Okay. So if we're talking about the relationships between bodies and machines, or bodies and technology, thinking about what makes a body and what makes us is also really important, right? Because as we've already recognized, this is opening up and becoming maybe not quite so easily identifiable as before. So before I talk about affect and bodies, I've got a quote from another sci-fi book, Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. Your mistake, Ung says, is a character who had been in a wheelchair, but throughout the novel upgrades this wheelchair so it's pretty much like a tank partway through. But he says partway through this, your mistake, Ung says, is that you think that all mechanically assisted organisms like me are pathetic cripples. In fact, we are better than we were before. And I've used an image of from a Nick Knight photo shoot for Dazed and Confused back in '97 or something. I can't remember if I wrote this down. That had all the models in it were, quotes, disabled. And I'm going to come back to that term in a little while. But one of the models was Amy Mullins, who became quite famous. She did a lot of work for Alexander McQueen. Alexander McQueen had some special sort of wooden boot legs carved for her. She's double amputation just below the knee. She was a model, but also an athlete, and she was one of the first to use these prostheses to help her run, and sometimes help her run faster than quotes baseline humans. I want to talk about this concept of ability and disability, and I want to question it and mess it up by referring to the work of Spinoza on bodies, which is my next move, and then I'm going to come back to Amy Mullins.
Specifically is one question, and the other question is whether it has to be, which is perhaps what you have answered, but whether it has to be introduced specifically by humans.
The second one, I think, is easier to answer, because I think I'd say, wow, that's really interesting. And maybe no, it doesn't have to be, but I hadn't thought of it before. There's no reason why we cannot think of ourselves as being impacted by things that have been created elsewhere, either elsewhere in the biosphere or in the technosphere. Yeah, why not? I'm happy to think that, for example, constructions that have been developed by artificial intelligence and then impacting me could change what we. Yeah, quite. You know, mutation could be seen as being a response, or an action in response, maybe not so much a reaction, but an action in response to other environmental triggers. Yeah. The other one I think is a little tougher. Well, I think the question about what's inside and outside we might already be messing up. So if we can think of ourselves as being dislocated from the inside of our body, then there's no reason why something that just happens to that data that is me can't impact and change what I am or might become. Absolutely. So it doesn't have to burrow under. It depends how we think of where the body is and how it opens up to things on the outside. Yeah. Good questions, thank you. I mean, is there anything else? Yeah.
I've just finished my dissertation on partly on technology, and I came across this writer called Dominic Pertman, who poses that things like love and communication and community can be considered themselves as technology. And he uses the example that even, for example, if you meet someone on a beach naked somewhere very removed from the civilized world, you still have a system of communication through language, which can be considered a technology, like, for example, by Niklas Luhmann. So I was many other writers have posited that we're all cyborgs, effectively cyborgs now, and maybe to have always been, this idea that technology is intrinsically human and inherent in us.
Technology is. No, I think that's a really interesting point. Technology is a really interesting word. It comes from the Greek techne and logos, and logos is sort of the rational investigation of something. Sort of rationality gives us logic, and other things, ology. Techne is really interesting. It's art and skill. We get technique from techne in a sort of skillful way. The Latin translation of techne was ars, that gives us art. And when we think of a book like The Art of War, that might be art, as in techne, as well as other types of art that we might think of more readily. The Art of Love, yes, that's really interesting. So that might have also been a techne. And I think I'm with you. I think there's probably so much more to technology. Sorry, I wonder what that was. Thinking of technology. But I think there's much more to technology than these things with wires and silicon. And maybe, I think you're utterly right to identify language as a technological construct. Yeah. Love is interesting. Love, and especially sort of neurotransmitters like oxytocin. And the delivery of oxytocin might be an interesting way of thinking about, you know, the cyborghood of love. But I think, yeah, the art of the techne of love might have some legs, if you know what I mean. I think it's an interesting point. I think we probably, even without machines and wires, we're probably much more technological than we care to sometimes imagine. And this thing called natural probably never existed anyway. Cool. Shall I move on? Shall we have a look at some... here we are. Some Spinoza. Really interesting character. His family fled Portugal with the Spanish Inquisition, a Jewish family, and fled to the Netherlands. He grew up in Amsterdam, and his ideas were so inflammatory, and they were so bonkers to his local community that the local Jewish community did the equivalent of excommunicating him. And his ideas were so bonkers that the local Christian communities excommunicated him as well, but he didn't even want to be one. They said, yeah, by the way, don't come here, we won't have you. He was a philosopher and a lens grinder, which I always really like as sort of a real hands-on practical thing. He wrote this book called The Ethics, and in The Ethics he has a definition of the body. Now we've been started to think about what bodies might be such that they can open up to the machinic. Okay? He says this. 1. Bodies are distinguished from one another in respect of motion and rest, quickness and slowness, and not in respect of substance. This is really important. We are speedy and slow, or utterly still. Doesn't matter what we're made of. We are these things that are in motion, or caused to come to rest. He goes further, he says, a body in motion or at rest, must be determined to motion or rest by another body. Which other body has been determined to motion by a third body, and that third again by a fourth, and so on to infinity. This is really, really radical. We're not thinking about bodies in terms of what they're made of or what their form and function are. We're talking about how speedy or slow they are and what their impact is upon the other bodies around them. And it's those things that determine what a body is. This was so bonkers radical for his time. So this first thing, bodies are distinguished from one another in respect of motion and rest, quickness and slowness, and not in respect of substance. Favourite philosopher of mine, Gilles Deleuze, says more recently that a body, however small it may be, is composed of an infinite number of particles, and it's the relation of motion and rest, of speeds and slownesses between particles that define the body, whether it's the individual particles or the conglomerations that they make in different ways. That's what's important. Not form and function. Doesn't matter what the form is. or what the functions are. What matters is the relationships between things and how they are speedy or slow. This is quite bonkers when I talk to, say, industrial designers who only ever think in terms of form and function and whether one comes before the other or whatever. It's like, yeah, forget all that stuff. Forget form and function. Don't design according to form and function. Design according to the particles and how they might be speedy or slow, and speed them up or slow them down. And then see what happens. I'm going to move on from that one. The other one, a body in motion or rest, must be determined to that by another body, and so on to infinity. What this says is that even though all of these particles, including the agglomerations of particles like you might see here, right, these are all in relationship to others, yeah, at different scales. And these bodies or individual particles impact others. This is why he calls it affect. And that bodies affect other bodies. And whether we're speedy or slow or at rest or otherwise is as a response to a relationship to other bodies. This is really important because this is why he talks about it in terms of ethics. When you think about your ethical relationships, you can think about the pressure of your activities on somebody else. Yeah? This is what ethics is for Spinoza. It's the ways of measuring your affects and your capacities for affecting and being affected by others. This is really important. So, I'm going to miss out another couple of Deleuze again, you will not define a body or mind by its form, nor by its organs or functions, and neither will you define it as a substance or a subject. So our bodies here are being totally exploded. To think about them in terms of form or function will then get us into discussions, or the necessary discussions about control and power, right? Because we think whether somebody has the right body or the wrong body, whether it's the right shape or the wrong shape, whether it's abled or disabled, whether it's the right substance or the wrong substance, right? What if we forgot all of that stuff and talked about people in terms of how it is that they impact each other? Because we will already be working within, by doing that, we'll be working within an ethical realm, right? This, I think, is really important. And it's really important for designers to consider, too. Again, Deleuze, a horse, a fish, a man, or even two men compared with one another do not have the same capacity to be affected. They are not affected by the same things, or not affected by the same things in the same way. This seems so obvious. This seems so obvious to me. It doesn't matter ethically what the forms and functions are. What matters is the affect, the generation and the reception of affect. And to measure and map those is to be ethical. But I think it's also political, right? These are the sorts of things that got Spinoza in trouble, because he was saying these things that went so against the received religious wisdoms of his time. I'm going to skip over. So what happens when we put these things together? Let's imagine that every body or thing is already an amalgam of intensive affective opportunities and potentials, right? And we are already many. We are already massively full of potential, some of which we understand and can encompass, and others which we cannot. Those bacteria are doing their own thing, and we're just providing them a host for it. And we just so happen, at a different qualitative level, benefit from these things, right? But if we are already many and open, what is the impact that being many and open will have on our sense or senses of self when these openings are already mediated through machines and with machines? What if we think about the way that Google holds our big data as being an important impact upon what we can or can't do as a thing, as a self, right? And this is where this way of thinking about bodies and their relationships with machines, and the sort of the ethical and possibly political discussions that we've come into right now, become really important in our times. So, here we have Amy Mullins again. Is there anything shocking about this picture these days? Yeah. I remember when first using this where the most shocking things were her legs, but these days it's probably her toplessness. So the ways in which we understand and understand the affective impact of bodies is just changed even over the last 20 years, right?
Well, it's the juxtaposition, Jamie, isn't it? It's the juxtaposition of the toplessness with the prosthetic legs that was intended to be shocking.
Yeah,
Taken together,
by Nick Knight. Yeah.
taken together, those two things are greater than the sum of their parts in terms of their cultural impact. That's what I would.
Yeah. That makes sense. That makes sense to me. I was just interested. Jane Bennett again. There was never any time when human agency was anything other than the interfolding network of humanity and non-humanity. We've been talking about that in terms of humans and our bacteria, right? And today this mingling has become harder to ignore. This mingling also incorporates the machinic, the worldwide network that supports the production and dissemination of data, and its consumption, I should say, too. And that we are already not only opened up to an interfolding network of humanity and biological non-humanity, but add into that a mingling of the machinic in our becoming cyborg, as I would have put it 20 years ago. This then is really important to us, especially in an institution like this one, because we need to think to ourselves, what is it that we allow for the future affective capacities of humans through what we do creatively, okay? Because the stuff that we create and put into the world has that affective impact upon us and who we are and what we might be, right? So this cyborgness isn't only about what are the opportunities or possibilities that there are for humans in their interaction with machines, but what are the ethical, political, and other opportunities for agency, for acting, that are allowed or disallowed by the sorts of things that we all do here? What is the environment that you, designers, artists, innovation managers, and so on, who are here, what are the environments that you will produce, or the things that you might produce that will enable or allow us to become something more, or at least other than what we are right now? And this then is the ethical and political import of thinking of cyborgs, especially in a space like this. Thank you.